love and life interested me so that I dared to knock at the door of the cosmos.
Welcome to the Sun Ra Arkive Podcast. Since 2002, Sun Ra Arkive has been an extension of my personal study and sharing those discoveries with others. Our goal is dedicated to preserving the legacy of jazz musician, composer, keyboard pioneer, visionary philosopher, and band leader Sun Ra and his group of master musicians, the Sun Ra Orchestra. You can follow us online at facebook.com/Sun Ra Arkive and explore our library of articles at sunraarchive.blogspot.com.
Boys and girls, and ladies and gentlemen, would you like to have a magic key that would open up for you the sound of any combination of letters that you might like to know? Well, Miss Coleman has for you now just such a key. It's called the sociophonic key, and will give to you the sound of anything that you might like to know.
Hello?
Hi, Christopher. This is Brian.
Hi, Brian. How are you?
I'm good. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I'm really excited to talk, and I really appreciate you making the time. I'd like to welcome Brian Harnetty to the Sun Ra Arkive Podcast. Brian is a musician, keyboardist, composer, and multimedia artist who is based out of Columbus, Ohio. Brian has 6 full-length releases to date, the most recent being Many Hands Volume 2, which was released this April of 2020. As an interdisciplinary artist, Brian uses sound and listening to foster social change, and you can find his records on a multitude of labels from Carl, Dust to Digital, Atavistic, Winesap, and Scioto Records.
Hello? Hey, I'm there.
So we're gathered here today to talk about you as an artist, Brian, and the intentions and methods that go into your work. And most specifically, for a Sun Ra focus, I'd like to talk about your full-length release, The Star-Faced One, which came out in 2013 on Atavistic Records, as well as the 7-inch, The Sociophonic Key that preceded it in 2012 on Scioto Records, and kind of talk about your work and everything that goes into it with that Sun Ra focus. Before we kind of get into those particular works and everything that went into it, I'd like to just learn a little bit about your inspirations, from a young age to where you are now that got you interested in art and music and communicating in that way.
Sure. How far back do you want to go?
Well, what made you first love music? What made you first, have a sense of wonderment about art, and that's how you process the world and engage with the world? What was your first love?
I didn't come from a especially musical family, but my grandfather was a musician, but he died before I was born, so it sort of skipped a generation. And then I started taking piano lessons at a pretty early age and really liked it. I think the first thing that really made me want to be a composer was going and watching Shostakovich, of all people. The local symphony was doing his 11th symphony, and it just felt like when the first note started, it felt like fog was dripping off of the stage, and I was hooked. And from there, I did music in college and studied music composition and really enjoyed it. And then I took a few years off and then went to graduate school in the UK and studied music composition there with a couple of different teachers, probably most notably a teacher named Michael Finnessy, who is a well-known British composer, and also Steve Martland, who came from a very different style of music, but they both influenced me a lot. Finnessy in particular loved to use other people's music and musical borrowing in general, which was something that I gravitated to very strongly. And then he would use notated music, or he would transcribe music and then work with it that way as material. But when I got out, I started to realize that wasn't the part that I really loved. What I loved the most about musical borrowing was the actual recordings themselves and the grain of the recordings and the voices, the hiss and the scratch and so forth. that was something that I just couldn't capture in a musical score. And so I sort of backed away from that world and embraced the sampling world. And from there, I started to have an interest in archives and in regional and local places around Ohio and the larger Appalachian region and then the larger Midwestern region, which brought me in two weird directions. One was to Appalachia and to a lot of traditional and old-timey musics, and the other was in the seemingly opposite direction of Chicago and Sun Ra. And then since then, for the past 10 years, I've been working in southeastern Ohio, which is the Appalachian part of the state, both on creative projects and also with nonprofits, helping to build a stronger economy there that's like not based on extraction and coal mining and so forth. But the projects that I largely do deal with archives and sound, and then I have my own ensemble and we play along with those sounds. So there's the short version of my life in sound and music.
Close your eyes, rest your head on my shoulder and sleep. Close your eyes, and I will close mine. Close your eyes. Bing, bing. That's your trouble, Harry. You can't remember. We slowing the process up, boy. We not be telling you, lay out, Harry. 1971. Look, down button.
So in addition to the performing aspect of music in your formative years, was there also an interest in recording technology, engineering, and more the technical side of music creation as well?
No, my turn or flip or whatever came much later. So I was actually trained, as a classical composer. And so my world was all around the score and learning how to deal with notation and to make it work and how to translate that to performers. And so that's why it felt like a really strong turn to me, because I realized that there was some aspect that, was missing. And for me, it was recorded sound and the medium itself. So yeah, I don't have a lot of training as far as sound engineering. I've studied a bit about the history of, media and so forth, but I try to have good friends around me that are good engineers and can help me out with problems that I might have.
1, 2. Marshall, 1, 2, 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2,
How did you discover the music of Sun Ra?
Well, let's see. I mean, it was probably like the late 90s. I was in my late 20s or whatever. And a friend of mine was moving away and he gave me just to watch, his CD collection while he was away at school abroad for a year or two. And in there he had, a lot of recordings of Sun Ra. And so that, to me, not having any knowledge whatsoever, was my introduction. And then, so I was a fan. And then when I started to work with the record label Atavistic in Chicago, they had a related label that had to do with improvised music and jazz that was by the John Corbett Gallery. And then there was also a connection with Experimental Sound Studio, which was the place that was mastering the first records that I made. And they housed the Sun Ra recordings. So I got to know Lou Malazzi a little bit and the folks at ESS. And then from there, that sort of led to a commissioning project where they were commissioning musicians, writers, visual artists, filmmakers, all to interpret the Sun Ra archives in their own ways to sort of celebrate that it had just finished being digitized. And so that was back in 2009 or 2010. And so for me, it was a no-brainer, right, to a chance to really dive deep into this archive of recordings and make something of it. So yeah, that's how I came to that particular archive.
Have you stopped to realize what an exciting time this is to be alive? Fantastic things have already happened, and more are getting ready to happen. This is because the planet on which you're residing has entered the space age.
There are other artists as well that were commissioned within the same project to create works in their medium, incorporating materials from the Creative Audio Archive at Experimental Sound Studio as well. And I know that the kind of original project that perhaps led to the 7-inch and led to the full-length release was an installation that featured your work, and unlike the recorded releases, had a strong visual component. Can you talk about that original installation and the progression to the 7-inch and the full-length release?
Yeah, the installation was for ESS's gallery, which was called the Audible Gallery. And it was a 5-channel sound installation, and each channel was independent from the others. And it uses the same material as the album. It was a bit longer. I think it was probably over an hour long. And it used live instruments and the audio archive of Sun Ra. And for me, it was a pretty cool experience because you could sit in the room and hear 5 different cello parts by Fred Longberg Holm as he's responding to the Sun Ra recordings, for example. And it gave the project a real spatial quality. So that was the initial project. And then the album came out of that, I guess, 2.5 years later. And it was reduced a little bit and sort of tightened up and then changed to stereo. But it shares the same roots as the installation.
I wish, as a fan of surround sound music, I really wish that I could have experienced that in person.
Yeah, I wish I had documented it more. It was sort of before I had good documenting chops. So, yeah.
What are the chances that we'll get a surround sound release in the future?
I don't know. I mean, I still have all the files. I think the big thing is that, you know, the cuts I made to make the album, I felt made it like a stronger project overall, a little bit leaner, and it really put more of the focus on how the samples from the archive were both, you know, independent of the group that I was working with, but also we were sort of like interlocking with it in different ways. So I don't know. I'd have to, maybe someday I can, work through it again.
I'd like to talk about the composition process and the performance process of how, the Starface one came to be. But before we do that, I'd like to hear your experience and how the genesis of the project, as far as source materials from the audio archive, were curated and given to you. Meaning, were materials identified and given to you beforehand to react to and choose what you wanted to work with? Or were you actually involved in the research and discovery process in the archive and made those decisions yourself?
Well, like I said, they had just finished digitizing the entire collection, which took a number of years to do. And the digitization process at that time, which was only a little over a decade ago, still felt fairly magical to me. So I had spent some time in Chicago before just to say hello. But when I received the recordings from the archive, they basically came in the mail in an iPod and with a giant sort of 3-ring binder. That was the entirety of the catalog. So that was a pretty crazy thing to receive in the mail, it's over 500 recordings or cassette and reel-to-reel tape recordings. And the collection, as you probably know, is not just recordings of Sun Ra and the orchestra, but also day-to-day things that he may have recorded or other people might have recorded and just ended up in his boxes. Sometimes it's a little bit hard to tell. So, for example, there might be a Busch beer commercial that could have been some of the members doing a side project and, for the music for it. But there was also things that Sun Ra recorded off of the television and the radio. And for me, my process of moving through all of those recordings, the hundreds and hundreds of hours of it, was just to dive in and to start listening as much as I could. And this actually, weirdly enough, is the same experience that the other people that were commissioned had. It was very similar. We all found ourselves listening for 2 or 3 or 4, hours a day just to sort of get closer somehow through the medium of recording to Sun Ra and to the musicians. I also, very carefully went through the catalog according to the text. the technicians at experimental sound studios made some notes about things, which was really helpful. And so I would use that as kind of like a guide, as a way to move through that isn't quite random, but achieves those results. So if something seemed odd to me or sort of out of place, that piqued my interest. I feel like I listened to most of it over the several months that I had those recordings, which incidentally I had to send back to them in Chicago as part of the contract. But I felt like I got to hear most of it. And I just used the idea of Sun Ra as the connection through everything. So no matter how disparate the recordings were, I just somehow used the idea that they somehow found and filtered through him, that I could bring these really odd things together. So, there might be a radio announcement where someone's talking about a dentist, but then he mentions Sun Ra later on. Or there was somebody talking about, the power of the mind being like a spaceship. And I just imagined that Sun Ra recorded that. Or there was like an NBC news broadcast from 1973 or 74 that doesn't seem to have anything to do with him, but I could imagine Sun Ra sitting there recording his television for one reason or another.
We're sitting in for Jay, who was going to go to the dentist, but Sun Ra just walked in, so Jay's going to talk to Sun Ra.
As music lovers and record collections, we know that a collection can tell you a lot about a person and their sensibilities. Is there an overall idea about this collection that you take away from it and the sensibility as to which it was kind of compiled over the years?
Yeah, I think that says one thing about Sun Ra, but it also says another thing about who's doing the collecting. It says a lot about John Corbett, who was the person who was able to obtain the recordings later on and then turn them into an official collection, as it were. And so, yeah, it seems an archive always seems like the product of many minds, and I don't think this is any different. Yeah, I think sort of my overall impression through the particular archive of Sun Ra was just the incredible amount of work that they did. So there was a lot of rehearsal tapes where he would rehearse something over and over again, and each time, with very explicit instructions to the musicians. I thought that was very interesting. I also really appreciated sort of his wordplay. It's really interesting. There's one recording that I have that I just couldn't get over, which was his connecting the words so, and soul, like S-O, S-E-W, and S-O-U-L, to, and sort of finding through this, like through entomology or whatever, his own way through words and language. And I think that becomes really apparent. It also is interesting how he just sort of absorbed so much that was around him. And so, making recordings from the television, or, recording recording his own poems, over the phone just because he liked the way it sounded. All of these things just show an incredibly curious mind, and also the sort of wherewithal to document it as he went along.
Ready? What can I say other than the music itself? Music? Yes. To the ears that dare to hear, that dare to hear, that dare to hear.
That idea of words, there's a quote. So there's two additional documents for this particular work of yours that are available. One is a paper that talks about the idea of archiving and archival interactive performance that you've published, as well as the accompanying score to the Star-Faced one, which is available with purchased on bandcamp.com. And there's one quote that seems to have great significance to you that I found particularly instructive listening to and enjoying and trying to understand your work. And that's the quote from Amiri Baraka about Sun Ra's wordplay, which was that Ra taught that a word is not only an idea, but a sound. It has force and power, and its many meanings manifest at once. And that speaks to two things to me in listening to your work. First, there's the idea of the multiplicity and permutation of words, as you said, that Sun Ra was so fond of doing so, S-O, so, S-O-W, and soul. And the idea of homophones as applied to words like rose, meaning to rise, and rose, meaning the flower. That concept also applies to music and the synchronicity and movement of music. And that quote made me think about your presentation in that homophones apply to the interpretation of your work, and in particular this piece that I've been spending so much time in that there are a multitude of ways to listen to this music. And I will admit that since it came out in 2013, every time I've revisited it, I've heard it with a different lens based on where I am or the exploration I've done about your work and the intention behind it. But I think that's a particularly pertinent way in to this work, because for people that are listening to this, they're Sun Ra fans, and they may come at the work with an expectation that the presentation would be like an album, and perhaps they're focusing on trying to hear previously unknown pieces of the Sun Ra archives.
Right.
But the more you listen to this work, I think I took it for granted on first listening how much of a collaborative effort it is as far as your instrumentation, your composition, and then the performances of the work. So I just wanted to call attention to that quote, because for me, the more I actually thought about it, the more I realized that that was really a key, at least for me, to kind of understanding this work that you've presented. Am I on point with that? Is there anything else that you'd like to add to that I'm perhaps missing?
Yeah, no, I mean, I agree with you. And I think that the other thing that I love about Sun Ra's use of homophones and wordplay, basically, is that he uses it within music, he uses it within words, but he also uses it culturally. And I feel like it's part and parcel with the set of tools that he developed to deal with and to circumvent and to create something new around this world of racism and, you know, growing up in the Jim Crow era in particular. And I think that this idea that language is malleable and that you can rewrite what the words' meanings are also applies to his understanding of history, and that he was very consciously rewriting history in a way that was anti-racist and against the way that he grew up. I think that seems to tie in so well with this idea of homophones and wordplay. And then, yes, you know, my own use is definitely connected to it and inspired by that. And then, you know, the album really works as a kind of collage. And also, I mean, it's kind of like a musical portrait in a way, which shows that I'm not sitting back objectively and trying to paint some sort of objective, accurate picture of Sun Ra, but instead I'm very subjective and very much in the middle of it and an active participant through the archive. And in that way, I mean, Sun Ra as the author gets really blurry, and when, you know, anyone sort of reinterprets things, all of those questions start to creep up. It can be both exciting and also sort of unnerving and can set off some red flags if you're not very careful about it. And then also there's a sense of liberation with it, but also a kind of loss too. And so, yeah, that to me was the sort of main influence, is the idea of wordplay, and then also how might that translate to the archive. And then how could the archive itself be like a gigantic instrument that, you know, I could try to figure out how to play.
When you say a sense of loss, what do you mean?
Well, I mean, this is one of the reasons why I think it's great that ESS commissions several people and not just one. And that is that I am by no means an authority on Sun Ra, and I'm not trying to create an authoritative interpretation of his work. And one way to deal with that is to have many different people approaching the same archive from their own backgrounds and having their own voices as part of that mix. So I guess that's the sort of main thrust from that. And then I guess also because Sun Ra, you know, isn't alive, and this is all done much later, I mean, he doesn't really have a say, you know what I mean? Like, so that is a problematic spot that you have to try to reconcile, and maybe you can't always answer would he have been okay with this? Would he have liked it? That kind of question. But you try to reconcile that as much as possible. And so that might be the sense of loss, that, all of us sort of reinterpreting the archive somehow affects his authorship in some way or another. One way to deal with that, in addition to having many people, is to also always be rooted to the archive and to Sun Ra, and then always point back to it, so that you don't claim it all as your own, but you say, this is where this comes from. If you would like to listen to it, this is where you can, and always sort of having that sense of acknowledgement there.
May the 2nd, 1973.
You raise a couple of, I think, really interesting and pertinent points in regards to Sun Ra, other than perhaps the musicians in the orchestra themselves who spent many years with Sun Ra. There can never be any such thing as a Sun Ra authority. And I say that with the utmost respect to the Sun Ra authorities that are out there in the community. And I'm sure that none of them would ever claim to be an authority. Mm-hmm. But what that causes then is the need for and dependence on community to give perspective and illumination to, this multitude of work and these many ideas. And it kind of disperses that sense of authority or ownership, which I think is a wonderful testament to his work and ideas, that so many years later, individuals are still out there trying to learn from, understand, and deal with it. That's a wonderful testament there. And I think that it also shows that as you and the other artists that worked on these commissions, that everybody kind of testified to the feeling that their relationship to Sun Ra's music and the work was similar to the teacher and student relationship, which I think, if nothing else, would amuse him.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there was a really nice quote from Colleen Smith, who was another person who worked with the archive and was commissioned to do projects, which was exactly that. And that sort of floored me, that her experiences felt so familiar to me, that just by simply spending time with the recordings, not only time gets blurry, but so does the line between the living and the dead. And so you feel like you're sort of absorbing the archive the sort of longer that you spend with the recordings. You start to also, repeated listenings has a similar effect, right? Where you start to memorize different lines that are just, said or thrown off, and they take on a very strong importance to you.
I would.
In your papers and your writings, you speak to several concepts that kind of are instructing your work and specifically were on your mind, the Sun Ra project. Can you talk a little bit about the concepts that guided you before the composition process, and then the composition process in and of itself? And I'm curious, as someone who clearly has very strong kind of conceptual foundation and continuity in their work, how much of your approach was predetermined, and, was it predetermined, number one, and how did that transform and change throughout the composition process?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think, beforehand, I'd been working with archives for almost a decade at that time. And I learned very quickly that one of the initial things you want to do is establish a relationship with as many people as you can that are connected to the community. And this was still fairly early to me, but I think having a good relationship with the people who have the rights to the recordings, as well as archivists and so forth, became really important. So, for example, I had to enter a sort of contract with Sun Ra's nephew, who was sort of the main person behind who holds the rights to the archival materials. And to me, that was a really important part of the process, because it kept me anchored in a way And I kept him, and I kept, the musicians, and I kept Sun Ra himself in mind, as well as the people who were already, diehard fans, for example, and thought of them as an audience. And so how do I make something that can contribute to this world, but also does so with as much respect and stewardship as I possibly can muster? And then the composition process itself, basically, I took the samples and sort of narrowed them down as much as I could. And then from there, I tried to find different ways to organize them. I think one of the main ways was arbitrary. It was like according to dates. And so, the album is sort of loosely based on like 4 years worth of recordings, even though the archives are over a longer period of time. But for me, it was just a way to organize the recording. And then I started to make small little pieces and compose them out that might sort of complement or go with. They're just, little ideas, or I don't know what you want to call them, cells or melodies or thoughts. And from there, I sort of gave them out to, the musicians that I was working with, which included Fred Longberg-Holm on cello and Jeff Kimmel on bass clarinet and Jeremy Woodruff on flute and saxophone, and Aaron Michael Butler on vibraphone, and really just gave them the Sun Ra samples that I had chosen and asked them to use those samples as a kind of, a click track, for lack of a better term. And what that did was they had a bit of material from me, they had the recording from Sun Ra, and they were listening to the recording while improvising with the material. That process basically meant that us 5 individuals were pretending that we were, playing along with the orchestra in some way, shape, or fashion. And then those musicians all sent their materials back to me. And then it felt like I had a second archive of material that I could use to collage alongside the archival recordings. As far as conceptual foundation, I certainly used the Sun Ra notions of collage and homophones and wordplay, like I said before. But I also, tried to make as many connections of my own within it too. So that is to say that I'm not a jazz musician. I've studied it, but it's not what I've dedicated my life to. And I've tried to be as upfront about that as possible. So the project has as much of my personality in it as anything else. And certainly, what materials I chose, the sort of curation of those materials, and then, how everyone reacted to it, all sort of got filtered through my own sort of understanding and vision of the project.
So the recording process itself sounds as though it was captured remotely. It wasn't recorded as a live performance altogether.
Yeah, that's true. And I've been doing that for a long time, partially just out of necessity. A lot of the musicians that I know, I first met back when I was studying abroad in the UK. And so we are sort of far flung around the world. So I have developed this practice of asking people that I know and trust that are good home record people, and I don't mind a sort of DIY type sound, to make the recordings individually. And then also I found out that it's a way to trick my own brain. I really like pre-made material to work with and to collage with. And this was a way for me to do a little bit of both, to have my own compositional voice in there, but also to work with something that felt fresh and new because it had interpretations in it that I couldn't anticipate. So that to me made the collaging and then ultimately the composing process really exciting. And it was a way to get away from what I was saying earlier, the notated page as things looking good on the page, but not sounding the way I wanted it to. So yeah, I still do that to this day. It's working really well, obviously, in these times of the pandemic, but yeah, I've been doing it for a long time.
What has the reaction been to this work, not only in the Sun Ra community, but perhaps in the larger community that your work engages in?
Yeah, I mean, it's been a long process. I feel like all of the projects I do take a very long time. For example, I've spent the last decade, working in Appalachian, Ohio to do a series of projects. And I think the original installation was in 2010 and the album came out in 2013. And for me, I think the real delight and the highlight was then to be able to perform it live with the musicians. So again, I do this sort of backwards composition process where I'm asking people to respond individually by themselves, and then I collage it together. But it was such a delight to be able to play with those musicians live and have the sort of general framework of the album, but to let them improvise and make it their own in that setting. And so that was a real highlight. I think, it was nice to be in correspondence with a lot of people around it. But I also think, I don't perform a lot. So I think that the few performances that were done felt very special to me about it.
I wasn't aware that the work had been performed live. Where was that?
Yeah, we premiered it at the Wexner Center for the Arts here in Columbus, Ohio.
Were those performances recorded? Are they?
Yeah, there's a few recordings that were just done off the board, and those are up on SoundCloud. I think on my page on SoundCloud, there's like a couple of recordings there. But it's been a while since I've listened to them, so I really enjoyed that. And then the idea for me keeps growing. Right, it would be nice to be able to go back again someday, obviously with their permission, to think about how I've changed over the past decade and how that might change my interaction with the archive again.
I hope that happens.
Yeah, me too.
I think that there's, a lot of value in the work that has come out of your and the other artists' commissions from the creative, audio archive. And I think that not only would I like to hear other work from you based on that archive and your ideas, but I think it's a part of a much larger lineage that I hope is added to and evolves over the years.
Yeah, same. Just for example, Colleen Smith's work, she's largely based in video, but she has just exploded. Like, her work is so amazing and beautiful, and I always see it. I just went to like a retrospective of hers last summer at Mass MoCA, and I always see it through that lens, that listening lens. And yeah, it's so good. There's one small little video that she made of a young girl just spinning and dancing, but she's, paired it with a Sun Ra recording. And it's filled with so much joy, and it's so cool to see. And then, of course, Damon Locks too. I don't know if you've heard his recent recordings with the Black Monument Ensemble. Again, the whole approach and ethos behind it is obviously rooted in his own personality and his visual works and his previous musical works. But I also hear a lot of influence, from Sun Ra in there in a really positive way. I think it's on the label's International Anthem. I think it's up on Bandcamp now.
After the sound of the tone, please leave your name and telephone number. Your call will be returned.
I would encourage anybody that's listening not only to listen to your work and get these recordings if they haven't already, but also to do some, further research, not only into the writings that you've put out in regards to the Starface one, but also your other work. So through that Sun Ra lens, people that are coming to this music as Sun Ra fans, what other work of yours would you suggest that they jump off to next to check out?
Well, the Sun Ra work really, it stands out, and it's very different from most of the other work that I've done. certainly over the past decade or so. But with that in mind, if you have an interest in recordings and how recordings work and how you might perform an archive, then it starts to make sense, where I'm coming from. So, for example, one of the more recent projects that I've done, which is called Shawnee, Ohio, is based on a small Appalachian town in Ohio. And it seems like it's worlds apart from Sun Ra, but it shares a similar process of my spending a lot of time through research to understand the sort of history of a place and the people that are there, a kind of musical portraiture of several different people this time, and then also paying close attention to the music that they listen to. And then from there, using that music as initial material for me to create my own material and then create a world in which these archival recordings can be, not chopped up so much, but sort of left alone as much as they could, but also to tell multiple stories that can, grow as you listen to the album and hear them interacting with each other. Yeah, I kind of think about books a lot, and I think about writers and novels, for example, and think about making music in those ways where you're tackling an entire idea and subject and you're trying to evoke that world as a setting for the material to shine.
There's a gentleman at the podium. May I have your name, sir?
My name is Sun Ra.
Yes.
And I want to say that there's another way for the West, that the East have things that haven't really proven themselves as far as making a happier world for the East, and therefore, for the West, there's another choice, namely me.
You? Sun Ra.
That's
now,
right.
Is this given name or one you simply created?
Sun Ra is my vibrational name.
Your vibration?
Yes, the people are what they are, and I happen to vibrate to the name Ra.
Well, how did
all night, all day, all right, you say it's what you want and what you need. It's the one damn thing for which I bleed. So
these ancient Egyptians that you speak of have a spokesman other than yourself?
Well, who should be a better spokesman for the ancient Egyptians than Ra?
Well, I just don't know, Ra.
That's the way it is written, and as it is written, so it is.
Well, I'll just have to take your word for it. I thank you for coming up, and good luck in your pyramid.
Yeah.
Well, I'd like to have you back sometime and hear your space music. Would you make arrangements?
Yes, quite so. It's time for America to hear it.
I don't know that we're ready for it, but I'd be delighted to listen to it. Thank you so much.
Where can people learn more about what you're doing, follow what you're doing, and stay tuned in for what's next for you?
Yeah, sure. I have a website which I use as a kind of archive of all past projects and so forth, which is just brianharnetty.com. You can stream stuff, in all the usual places, but I've also really, over the past year, taken a shine to Bandcamp. I've put up 3 new albums and 3 of the atavistic albums up on Bandcamp as reissues. And then the Shawnee, Ohio album is also on Bandcamp through Carl Records, which is a German label. And then I've done some work with Dust to Digital, which is a really great label based in Atlanta. They, by and large, do reissues of old recordings, again, overlapping with my interests in archival sounds. But we did an album together in 2015 called Rawhead and Bloody Bones, which is basically young children telling sort of gruesome folk tales. And I've set those to music as well.
Thank you very much for the work that you're doing. Appreciate you sharing your time with me.
Yeah, well, thank you very much for asking me. And it's been really nice to talk with you as well.
I hope we get to talk again someday. And I will be wishing for the 5/1 release.
Okay.
As well as the vinyl pressing at some point.
Oh yeah, Damon Locks gave me permission to use one of his collages for the cover of the CD.
Yeah, it's great.
I love that image so much, and he hounded me, for a few years. I was just like, man, this would be really great as a record cover, and I agree with him. But someday we'll get there. Someday.
I wish you and your family well, Brian, and thank you again. Truly appreciated.
Yeah, nice to talk with you, Christopher.
All right. Take care of yourself.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
different things. Now here's another word that's very important. Now you can permutate that word as P-A-T-H. Now path is very important because you got a word based on path saying pathetic. Now that indicates that this path is something pitiful. That things that happen on this planet are bad is because of this path, which is a way, you see? It's a way that you have adopted. Every man is judged by the way. Now, black men have the wrong code. Watch what you're saying, because you're going to have to give an account for it. In other words, you're going to reap what you sow. Now, that reap what you sow is another thing that is dangerous. You're going to reap what you sow. That's what you think it means. But that's also that you got the phonetic. You're going to reap what you sow. Now, what is that? Sow means something. You say, it is so. It means something that you make true. It's over there with this truth thing. You're going to, whatever you call the truth, you see, you're going to get that back. Now you're going to reap what you sow. Now what's sow? It's represented by plus, like you said. So, that's positive.
Excerpts of the music of Sun Ra are used with permission of Sun Ra LLC. Sun Ra Arkive, Episode 1, Copyright 2020, Sun Ra Arkive with a K.